Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this ski seminar, which is actually our third seminar this semester. And we have the pleasure of welcoming Adrian Parker, who is professor of psychology here at the University of Gothenburg. And as far as I have been able to find out, Adrian has actually always been interested in areas of psychology that are not totally mainstream. And so he's interested in, as you see here, paranormal phenomena, such as ESP, sometimes called extrasensory perception, etc. And that means that he has not always had, what shall we call, the easiest way forward in his career. He's had to do some extra arguing for his interests. And that has given him some insights on the way Swedish universities and perhaps universities in other countries also work when it comes to investigating subjects which are not totally mainstream within a discipline. And I hope we have other people here who have these interests a little on the, let's call it outside of the mainstream. For example, Alexander, you are like that. I don't know if you are or not. We'll see. Okay, in any case, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Yep.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jens. In one way, I don't consider myself outside mainstream. After all, it's about consciousness and what is more central to psychology than consciousness. But you'll find very little consciousness in psychology departments. You often have to go to a place like this to be able to discuss such, really important topics. The publics are really interested in this area, but the academics, for various reasons that I'm going to go into, they shy away from consciousness and certainly from the paranormal. Jens was just saying my difficulties. I remember when I first came here, my education is primarily my profession is as a clinical psychologist. I spoke to a professor here, and actually Henry Montgomery, I can say, and he said the chances of you making it here are very, very little. You have two handicaps. First of all, you're not Swedish, which is very honest of him, and secondly, you have an interest in things that are not approved. And it's enough with one handicap. So I think I've proved him wrong, but it has been an enormous fight, and that's where I'm going to start. Now, just check it out first. I have my PowerPoint in Swedish. How many of you understand Swedish or can read Swedish? And there's some who don't. Well, okay. How is it, Jens? You can tell me. You're the expert. I've never done this before. Given overheads in Swedish and spoken English. That must be a bit of a cognitive load.
Yes, I have done it very often. You get better at it with practice.
No, not for me, but for you.
Well, I think we will. It's normal practice. We very often have had the opposite. We've had English overheads and then Swedish talk.
We use the subtext.
Yeah.
It produces cognitive flexibility.
But you watch film and you see the subtitle.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk about these two topics, and it's quite a task I've taken for myself. What is consciousness and what is the paranormal? And I think these are really important challenges for natural science. It's probably the greatest challenges I think that natural science has to manage in order to go forward with. So my mission today is to update you on current controversies, there's quite a lot of those, and current research findings and theories. And I'm also going to attempt to give some suggestions about how we can go forward, because this is a seminar in which I think we want to discuss new ideas about progress. So we begin with the actual situation, the current situation, to say, concerning the controversies. sometimes these controversies are just totally overwhelming. They just seem to get worse and worse, and I feel we're really stuck in the middle because there are sort of so-called almost, I'm reluctant to call them skeptics, but extreme members of what you can call scientism on one side and New Ages on the other. And I found this little picture I took of one of my sons when he was a bit smaller than he is now, and this is the situation I sometimes feel to be in. It does feel as though they're Como fighters, wrestlers, and this situation gets really quite heavy at times. Yeah, Jens alluded to this, and the Lund controversy. I was actually placed first for this position, but Lund thought they could get out of parapsychology and keep the money, but they didn't succeed. The person who was appointed was a kind of Trojan horse. As soon as he got the position, he started doing parapsychology, and the reaction, well, they didn't. To cut a long story short, we made some claims which led to a kind of situation which either they had to give him a Nobel Prize or try to get rid of him. And so it brought these headlines in the major Swedish newspaper. It's quite extreme for me. I've never experienced this in the UK. You would have to be a child molester to get this kind of reaction, where 9 professors go together and make a kind of petition. And they were joined by Henry Montgomery and also a colleague of mine, Joachim Westlund. And it gets worse. Chalmers University, in the spring, they had a science festival, and they put this up about pseudoscience, and they even, I don't think I've taken it there, even took the professor in Lund who got the position, Edson Cardina, as an example, and they used the word parasite to describe his position, which is, I would think, libelous. So these controversies go on. One that caught my attention also in late spring was from Newsweek, My Proof of Heaven. It's former Harvard brain surgeon, neuroscientist, in fact, who was quite skeptical towards these near-death experiences. He was well versed in the normal explanations for them and accepted these himself. There are quite normal explanations that we have the ability to fill in memories, to dramatize, and that the brain must always keep contact with reality and invent things and so on at the last moment. And so he's quite versed in these explanations and didn't believe at all in near-death experiences until he had one himself. And this when these near-death experiences went on for a couple of weeks apparently, during which he was in a coma. And he was so convinced that this was reality, or an alternative reality, that he wrote a book about his experiences and gave interviews, and for whatever reason, Newsweek decided to publish it. They don't usually publish anything on the paranormal, and fortunately he didn't use any para word, he just described his experience of heaven. And I think it's okay to speak about heaven, but not about the paranormal. And of course this produced enormous backlash from his former colleagues, and they came with some of the more usual explanations, perhaps a little more sophisticated. I wonder how many of you know Henry Edison's work at Stockholm. It's quite famous. It's showing how you can put a kind of plastic hand in front of somebody and substitute it for the real hand, and in the end they believe it's their own hand they feel to be touched by somebody prodding them. So this produces a kind of illusion, a body illusion, and the extension from that is that you can go further, so you can put a video camera behind somebody and then manipulate it so that they see themselves from behind, and they get the experience of something like an out-of-body experience. It's not the same, but the claims are often made that this explains away out-of-body experiences. and also epileptic fits, which sometimes give these kind of mystical hallucinations. But the last thing I think I mentioned before, that the brain has a creative ability, or a mind, if you like, has a creative ability to hallucinate and to make false memory images. You're not all psychologists, but in psychology this is generally accepted. I'll say a few words about it later, that reality isn't what we experience, it's actually creatively constructed from memory images and from expectancies. So that's one controversy, two controversies. There is, behind the whole thing, a kind of ongoing controversy. How many of you heard of Richard Dawkins? That's great, because I asked students, and out of 90, there are maybe 10 who have. And the public, not about the same, somewhere between 5 and 10. Okay, well, you know about his books, don't need to say much about that. How many of you heard of Sheldrake? Oh, he's not unknown either.
Sheldrake has been a guest at Ski.
Really? Why didn't you tell me? Amazing. When was this?
Either late 80s or early 90s.
Okay, right, yes. Okay, so you are familiar with it. Are you familiar with the TED Talks controversy? Sheldrake, who is a former Cambridge graduate and also has until recently had a fellowship in psychical research. That's a more neutral name for parapsykology. He's had that fellowship at Cambridge for about 4 years, and he's well known, and he was asked to give a TED's talk, and I thought his talk was quite brilliant, in fact, but apparently produced absolutely the opposite reaction from these, I don't know, is lacking a word here, these rather extreme believers in scientism. They were really very provoked by him, to the extent that they managed to put pressure on and get his talk removed. And this only produced another reaction, so an even bigger controversy, because the TED organization is supposed to be open-minded. Eventually they tried to find some kind of compromise and hide his talk somewhere on the website. It's difficult to find. There wasn't really so much this I think is kind of heresy in his talk. Maybe it is heresy to say things that everybody knows, but people don't want spread around. The problem with modern science is that it denies consciousness exists, it claims alternative medicine has no effect, and that telepathy doesn't exist, and the constancies in nature, and you probably know Planck's constant, that they're not absolute values. They seem to be changing during the years, and put it very simply, that these constancies are absolutely necessary for our world to hang together. They're the kind of glue that keeps the world together. And make a little changes are maybe okay, but a big change, and what happens? You eliminate yourself. The world would totally fall to bits, you wouldn't exist. And this is part of the thinking behind what's being discussed with multiverses, multi-universes. But we'll leave that for a moment. I want to now ask, why is there such enormous controversy over this? This has always amazed me, because I remember when I was about 11 or 12, I suddenly got an insight that actually Immanuel Kant got, and managed to put in much more philosophical words. I got the insight that our brain is a kind of arbitrary interpretation of the world. We have our fixed ways of thinking that are very dependent on our brain, and dependent thereby on evolution. Had evolution taken another way, and we might have different sense organs and different capacity to interpret the world, our whole experience might be different. So it's not so strange that there might be phenomena outside our normal ways of thinking for me. It's quite possible, and I'm not saying it's true, but I don't react in the same way that many people do. I recommended Journal of Consciousness Studies. In this context, they produced a volume in 2003 to try to find peace in this area, Psi Wars. They did the best they could, or the editors did, but they didn't succeed, sadly. It's a volume I recommend if you want to go further.
Can I just ask, what's the idea of that image?
What's the idea of what?
Of the picture?
The picture? Well, it's a bent gun. You know, that if you go on, I don't know if you're Swedish, but you must know that if you go outside the library, you find a statue of that. Yeah. Right. Okay. Look outside the library next time. You'll see that. We're trying to find peace in the air. Okay. Why is parapsychology so controversial? Because I guess it's the final battlefield for different theories of the mind-body relationship. My supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, is John Bella. He was a psychologist and philosopher, and very interested in parapsychology. He helped set up the Kirsten Chair of Parapsychology at Edinburgh University. So I think he summed it up very well, that everybody has their own theories, and we want to keep our theories, and sometimes it can be religious theories. There are some extreme skeptics who are Catholics, and it's okay for Jesus Christ to perform miracles, but not for somebody to read another person's mind or to heal people. Only Jesus Christ is allowed to heal people. So there's a kind of alliance between science and religion, and against heathen beliefs. You mustn't forget that the colleges, universities, have their roots as cloisters, and some of the same kind of positions are equated. You know, you have dean and deaconess. The word dean can be both in English, could be in a religious context as well as university context. So, and there's a kind of intolerance for ambiguity. There, sadly, is very little research on this, comparing extreme New Agers with extreme believers in scientism or materialism, whatever you want to call it, extreme skepticism. But the research that exists suggests that they share a common viewpoint, namely intolerance for ambiguity. They want things black and white, and they can't stand things being unclear. And this is part of the area. If you've got an interest in parapsychology, you have to have an open mind and be prepared to admit, you know, that it might be wrong sometimes, it might be very unclear at times. This is actually a bit of revenge for these extreme skeptics. They often sling out expressions like junk science or schizotype personality to describe people who have beliefs in this area. So the revenge is to call them suffering from obsessional debunking disorder. There's actually some seriousness in this. There's a book by Ian McGilchrist, and it's a well-researched book about difference in personality types and how we use different parts of the brain. Then there's a fear of death, and I think that I often notice in my colleagues, they quite happy for me to deal with all these people who have problems and so on. They go to funerals, and they have some, they, like many Swedes, have some belief that it's not the end, that they maybe might not explain everything. They can even go to a graveyard and pray to the lost loved ones, but they don't want any research and so they don't want to know about it, just in case the beliefs might be wrong. In fact, then it might be the end completely. There might be no life after death. And actually, many parapsychologists are atheists. Certainly, several people like John Belloff and some other mentors I'm going to mention shortly weren't really believers in afterlife. So I recently I'm currently involved in exchange with one of the 9 professors at Lund, and he has insisted that parapsychologists have a hidden agenda, and namely to prove afterlife, which is absolute nonsense. The only agenda is curiosity about things, I think, which concern us all. Our life is temporary, and we want to know about, surely want to know about consciousness and about phenomena that don't fit in challenge our view of the world. But Alain de Botton summarized it. We absorb ourselves as much as possible in our work and careers because we have one sole purpose, to keep such ideas out of our mind, and all thought of death and ban them. It's too frightening. But everything's actually researchable. Sam Parnia and Peter, and a friend, colleague of mine, Peter Fenwick, have been active in this near-death area. They're physicians and they've documented the various things that people experience. Sometimes a terminal lucidity, people have been in comas for weeks and then suddenly they, against all expectations, manage to get their faculties together and are able to have a short conversation to say farewell to the loved ones. But near-death experience is the real challenge, of course. And Sam Parnia has approached this with two angles, looking at the physiology, which is also taboo, what happens when people actually die, what happens to the brain. But he's also managed to set up, the whole budget is run on a shoestring, but set up a means of testing some of these near-death experiences where people say they can observe things from another angle. He has placed a series of random pictures or random numbers generated by a computer above and beyond the field of vision of the patient. The whole thing's ethically supervised and people have to agree to this. And he's worked on intensive care units. I think several hospitals have incorporated this methodology of generating a random number or a random picture above and beyond the field of vision. And the idea is, if there's anything to these near-death experiences, somebody should be able to come back and tell what was there. There have been a few studies, very few studies, where that does seem to have happened, 2 or 3 literally, over the years, but not with near-death experience, with out-of-body experience, not under ideal control conditions. So this would be fantastic if it worked, but as yet it hasn't worked. So those who are atheists can relax. There's no evidence as yet. In fact, it's a bit startling that it hasn't worked. I think there have been, I don't know, maybe 50, 60 patients who have been resuscitated. None of them have come back with the information. But the problem is modern medication, when people are dying, often affects memory. Has severe effects on memory, so people don't tend to have near-death experiences any longer when they're on the intensive ward, intensive wards. Okay, so there's, but it's researchable, that's the point. Why is there opposition to the whole idea of consciousness, and certainly the paranormal? Well, the Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick, I think he got his Nobel Prize when he was quite young, in his 20s, needed something else to do for the rest of his life, so he decided to solve the problem of consciousness. And being as he's a biochemist, he died a few years ago, but he had a sort of very materialistic approach to the whole thing. And now to this, back into English, this astonishing hypothesis of his. He says that you, all your worries, all your personal memories, and your ambitions, your sense of identity, and your free will, all that is in fact nothing more than the interaction between a set of nerve cells and their connected molecules. So that's all you are. Forget about consciousness, it's not important if it exists, it's only what is called an epiphenomenon. That's a sort of side reaction of the whole process, thinking about brain molecules. So that's a traditional viewpoint from neurobiochemistry, amongst quite a few neuroscientists. I'm just going to show a little film clip here. How many of you know the work of Benjamin Libet? A few. The idea, I put it very simply, is to check out what's happening when the brain decides something and when the mind decides something. And you can, by various means, make a rather precise measurement of when you have made the decision to move your finger and when you haven't. And you can measure what's happening in the brain, see if the two coincide. The public would generally think that the mind decides first and then the brain sort of shows its chemical reactions. But Liebert found there's a half second's difference, favouring the brain. And the most recent research has said it's now 6 seconds difference. See if this works, and I think this illustrates the whole thing. It's a setup now which is a little more elaborate than Liebert's, and the idea is now to choose which hand you're going to move. Let's see. And Anna-Katrina, I think you might recognise it. Let's see if we get the sound working actually. Right, I got the wrong one. Yes, maybe. Maybe I've turned the sound off. Sound strange, not getting sound. Everything's cleaned up for that. Okay, that's a shame because it's well, maybe you can hear it directly from
At the
this.
same time, the scanner system records when my brain made the decision, and the computer when I physically press the button.
Okay, Marcus, we are ready to start.
The test didn't take long, and to be honest, it's not terribly exciting. But I'm hoping the results will be a bit more interesting.
In your case, up to 6 seconds before you make up your mind, we can predict which decision you're going to make.
6 seconds?
Absolutely 6 seconds, yes.
6 seconds? Oh. So I was conscious of making a decision to press my right finger down. You're saying that 6 seconds earlier, my brain had already made that decision?
Exactly. So here we can show you how we do
I
it.
just say he's quite devastated, as he should be, by these results. And he really is very depressed at the end of this.
In this region, there's a pattern of brain activity that emerges before you make up your mind that tells us which way you're going to decide. And these blue regions, they get more active when you're going to choose left, and the yellow regions get more active when you're going to choose right.
That's a bit frightening. It sort of implies, therefore, my conscious decision is a very secondary thing to my actual brain activity.
Absolutely. It seems that there's a lot of unconscious brain activity going on that is shaping your decisions, and that your consciousness comes in at a very late stage in a decision.
So that's rather a frightening idea that I'm sort of hostage to neuronal activity that's happening 6 seconds earlier.
But I wouldn't call it a hostage situation, because the thing of it as a hostage implies a dualism between your conscious mind and your brain activity. But the conscious mind is encoded in brain activity, it's realized by brain activity, it's an aspect of your brain activity. And also the unconscious brain activity realizes certain aspects of you, it's in harmony with your beliefs and desires. So in most cases, it's not going to force you to do something you don't want to do.
So what do you think this has implications for the whole sort of study of trying to understand consciousness and what mind is inside here?
Well, absolutely. I think if we find that a person's thoughts are very closely encoded in their brain activity, we can't make a distinction between these thoughts and the brain activity. We don't need to assume that they're two separate entities existing in two different spaces. Rather, they're different aspects of the same physical process. So your consciousness is your brain activity, and that's what's leading your life. It seems that what our experiments reveal is that there's like a mechanism unfolding, a deterministic mechanism that leads up to your decision at a later point in time, and that was inevitable. It could only go one way.
Very depressed by this.
That has got to be the most shocking experiment I think I've seen on this journey. The fact that when I become conscious of making a choice, that John can 6 seconds earlier predict what I was going to do before I even realised what I was going to do. And that is absolutely extraordinary. 6 seconds is such a long time. I mean, I sort of don't find it so disturbing that, okay, sure, some part of my subconscious mind is building up to a conscious decision. But John, by looking inside my head, knows, his conscious knows before I consciously know what I'm going to do. That is really shocking.
Did you recognise it, Ollie Between? Charité. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Brilliant. So, you now know the conventional attitude towards consciousness. But what about parapsykology? I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there has been research in the area. In fact, critics often say there's been research in the area for 120 years and it still hasn't proven that there's any phenomenon exists, so it mustn't exist, can't exist if it hasn't proven it in 120 years. But in fact, if you do a proper calculation and make a kind of an equivalence about the amount of resources that has been spent in parapsychology, and try to compare it with another area of science, it's difficult to find another area of science that has so little in terms of resources. Anyway, it comes out at best to a few weeks of American psychology, the resources spent in parapsychology. A few weeks, not 120 years. And a few weeks on an area like, say, hypnosis or subliminal perception, you just, at best, can begin to develop a methodology. But nevertheless, there's this attitude that, since well-controlled experiments are said to be difficult to replicate, then ESP is really just an acronym for error someplace. Not extrasensory perception, but error someplace. And the spontaneous cases are dismissed because we know we create reality, we know the memory is unreliable, perception is unreliable, people are unreliable. If you believe, in fact, too much in the view of modern psychology, you wouldn't dare cross a road because everything's sort of being continually created. There's a bit of an over-belief in some of the findings of psychology. If you don't know what this is about, look at the Matrix. I usually have no problem with students who have all seen the Matrix and they're all now familiar with how you can create reality in the brain. And of course there's cheating, and there's consciousness cheating, unconscious cheating, reading body language. So many of the psychics mediums use these techniques. And then of course there are crazy people. It's often said with some truth in it, but perhaps shouldn't be exaggerated too much, that mediums are often developing a secondary personality and expressing this in a kind of theatrical form, a dramatic form. And some of them are even said to be a little psychotic. Many New Age people would end up in mental hospitals if they told some of their experiences to psychiatrists. And that you put it the other way around, perhaps it's New Age beliefs keep their mind together, and the worst thing they could do would be to see a psychiatrist. Another view is, to summarize the whole thing, is putting it together. Susan Blackmore, a colleague of mine, was interested in parapsychology for some years, and then there's a whole controversy whether she got positive results or not. But anyway, she has this attitude almost denying consciousness. She published a very good book about consciousness, but her own belief is that consciousness is a part of this dramatic invention all the time, that we're only conscious when we actually think if we're conscious, and we ask ourselves if we're conscious. Most of the time we're not conscious, most of the time we're zombies. So we have these spin doctors inside making up reasons why we do things all the time. I've done this with hypnosis sometimes, when I've hypnotized somebody and given them a post-traumatic suggestion that they should open the window or put their finger in the ear or whatever. When I say a certain word afterwards, and they have no memory of this, and sure enough it works. I wouldn't believe this unless I'd actually succeeded myself with it, but it does work. And you ask them, why do you do that? Oh, I thought it was getting a bit too hot in the room, I needed to open the door. I don't know, it's just a peculiar habit of mine to put my finger in my ear or something. They make up explanations, so we have these spin doctors all the time. There's a problem with this view of us as zombies. I wrote a little paper on this. Zombies don't have psychedelic trips. Zombies don't have these altered states of consciousness. They don't seek meaningfulness. So it's... I'm not convinced that it's the explanation of Susan Blackmore is a complete one. In fact, the whole mindfulness movement is aimed at increasing our consciousness, increasing our awareness, and all these gaps in our awareness. Another colleague has worked together closely with Susan Blackmore, is my friend, or he's a sort of friend in a way, but a kind of ambivalent relationship. Richard Wiseman, he graduated from the same university. He is formerly a parapsychologist, but he's a magician, and he's made a lot of publicity by trying to explain everything away. He's a great publicity seeker, but he's a lot of fun. And he wrote a new Scientist, how investigating weird or the paranormal, trying to sum up spirits and test everything and sleep at night. Each time the story is the same, the anecdotal evidence appears impressive at first glance, but once the phenomenon is subject to scientific scrutiny, vanishes into thin air. I wrote the same thing, except sent it to them, but they didn't publish it, unfortunately, except the ending was different. The thing is that Richard has taken part in some of the best scrutinized experiments at Edinburgh, where the Gansfeld experiments I'll be describing later, where they got positive results. He was in fact a security expert. He's also worked together with another researcher who had different styles and experiment, and she got positive results and he only got no results. So they got together and they were able to replicate this on one occasion, not on the second occasion. I think on 2 occasions replicated, but not on the third occasion. But he plays down that and doesn't like to speak about it. I thought it might be a little test. This is the last film I'm going to show, but I think it's a very instructive film, very lærerik, very revealing sort of film. So see what you make of this. This is from Skavlan, and this is Richard being interviewed.
Body language work. This may not work. I was realising just before we started that I've never done this outside of Britain. I've always done it with British people, and I've now realised that all the body language can be very different. But why about English? It's not going to work. This is perfect. Yes, that's right. So hold on to one of the cards if you want. Okay, that's good. I'm going to have a look at this card, but don't obviously show it to me. And don't give me any signals as to whether it's a red card or a black card. Okay, no signals at all. This is going to be much harder than okay, so no signals if it's a red or orange or hen. No, that's perfect. That's excellent. Okay. Let's imagine it's a red card. So it could be what we call a heart, or it could be a diamond. Okay. So your mind.
He's trying to show how mediums do it.
Or a diamond, and if it's a red card, then imagine them all spread out. So we have the 1, we call the ace here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We call them the court cards, the jack and the queen. Well, forget about those. Okay, so we're going somewhere here, and we're going to the 4, the 5, 6, okay, we're going higher, so don't give me any signals. Okay, 5, 6, okay, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that psychics do. They pick up on body language during reading.
But there is no body language.
That's not from your perspective, no. But from mine there is. I would go with a red card. I would go with a heart. I'm not certain of the number. It's not a court card. I would probably go with the 7 or the 8, maybe the 8 of hearts.
this is I have to say this is not rigged.
No.
I would lose all credibility, and this is not rigged. And how is this possible?
Okay, how is it possible? How did he do it? How many of you thought he managed to read body language there, as he said, like mediums do?
He did a very obvious thing, a red or a black card. I mean, he must have done something there to see the reaction from that very obvious thing.
Okay, right. Any other viewpoints?
Yeah. He might not read body language at all. He just did it in some of the
You are
standard ways.
a genuine skeptic. Many, I tell you, skeptics just accept what he says. And this is one of the revealing things that don't trust as these self-proclaimed skeptics. Richard is a magician. He's appearing on a program shown throughout Scandinavia. Magicians just don't, you don't do it relying on such an unreliable method as body language. You might be able to beat chance, but to actually get the exact card correct through body language and guarantee it is just not possible on a TV show. There are many methods that magicians use to be able to do this. The simplest, most obvious one is that you have marked cards. And Richard is fine. I like him, but I don't trust him a bit in these circumstances. And unfortunately, it's true. So there's a kind of lesson from this. So don't trust people who are self-proclaimed skeptics. And Richard often, even the researcher, I have to say, he presents things rather biasedly, in my opinion. But well, the evidence is there. And judge for yourself. Do you really think he was able to get the exact card correct and guarantee it? I mean, he'd be a fool if it didn't work, and obviously magicians have other means of doing it. But he is professor of educating the public, and I think there's an ethical aspect to this, in fact, and he's actually deceiving the public. Okay, so there is a kind of pseudo-skepticism. One has to look at the psychology of this a bit. And the methodology. There's a double standard sometimes. Research findings which fit into the materialistic zeitgeist are easily accepted. Those that don't are much more scrutinized. We just looked at that film by John Haynes, the film about choosing which hand to move with the magnetic resonance camera. And I guess you all accepted that, and the scientific community readily accepts it. But if you look more closely at it, you find the success rate is about, or even below the level of card guessing and parapsychology. It's 60%. And well, I certainly wouldn't accept such a finding, such an incredible finding without a lot more scrutiny, but because it fits into the accepted paradigm, it's easily bought. I'm not saying that he's faked his results, but I am saying that faking of results is an epidemic in science, and it's not easily discovered if the results seem to be plausible and are forward in the right way, with the right kind of authority and expectations. It's often said that science is self-correcting, even if cheating does occur, but that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, that's a gross assumption. Skepticism is often used as a weapon for maintaining the establishment view. And those strategies, if something doesn't fit in, it's immediately fixed with the label junk science. If the evidence is there, but well, in science you can't prove anything to 100%, so you immediately try to create this culture of uncertainty, and this is examples of global debate over global climate warming. But there are other more historical debates to the nicotine and cancer, because it took many years for that to be accepted. Then, there are genuine skeptics. I think we have possibly one there. But there are also wannabe skeptics who imitate it without actually knowing much about the literature, just in thing to be skeptical. There are those who are absolutely deny the facts, they're dogmatic skeptics, and are fun makers, scoffers. So there's a whole typology of skeptics. So, one of the most important methodologies for distinguishing between what is genuine and what is false in this whole area of science in general, but not just parapsychology, is use of blind methodologies, that the researchers shouldn't know which is a control group and which is the experimental group. You may find it interesting to look at two surveys. One was done by Sheldrake, one was done by Watt, who was sceptical towards these findings, but she produced pretty similar findings. And there you see it. Physical sciences don't use these blind methods. They think nature is blind, so it doesn't matter. They don't control for the experimenter's biases in making judgments, making measurements. Biological sciences, again, it's very low. Animal behavior. Psychology begins to appear. Medicine, of course, should use it. It should be compulsory for everything, but it obviously isn't. And parapsychology comes out top. So a lot of the criticisms about parapsychology are totally unjustified. There are genuine skeptics, and here's one who was a kind of mentor for me, Martin Johnson. He was professor, I think actually formerly he was professor, he was an emeritus professor in Lund. I've never managed to find out whether formerly he was a professor of parapsychology in Lund, without them knowing it, so to say. But anyway, he was professor at Utrecht University in Holland. He had many of his own remarkable, well-documented premonitions, dream premonitions of what was going to happen. And he grew up in the north of Sweden amongst the Samic people. He tried to apply scientific methods. He was rather skeptical. I think he still has a good reputation in Sweden for being skeptical. Even the most well-known skeptic, the revered skeptic, Ray Hyman, Ray Hyman has been a skeptic for 50 years now. He even had good words to say about Martin Johnson. And there is serious research. I mentioned Edinburgh, here on the right, the Crystal Unit. There was a professor in parapsychology, Bob Morris, who managed to make such a success of things that even the skeptics had to, so-called skeptics, had to more or less admit that he was doing very serious work. And they lowered the flags throughout the university for him when he died rather prematurely, because he had such a good reputation. It was the first time they ever did that, put the flags at half-mast. At Cambridge, there was this, Warwick Fellowship, and they organised a conference in 2000 on rational perspectives on the paranormal. There is a long tradition in the UK of, amongst the intelligentsia, and here's a list of them, it's not just naive, uneducated people. There are many famous professors. William James, for instance, was one of the presidents of the Society for Psychical Research, and it's called Psychical Research. Confuses people in Swedish, which in Sweden, which I'm actually glad, because I managed to get a course through the university called Consciousness and Psychical Research. But psychical research is, as the word actually says, research into psychic phenomena. There's even a prime minister amongst the list there of former presidents, so it is a very reputable society. Right, let's see how the time is. Exactly according to my planning. I want now to update you on current research, and to the extent that one can, theories. It's going to be a bit of a kind of sampling of what's going on. I want to take it from my own activity, my own professional activity as psychology department. Of course, I have to teach, and one of the courses I teach is actually an international course on consciousness studies and psychical research. And then I communicate with critics, which takes quite a bit of time. In fact, Anna Katrina often says I just give far too much time to critics, you should just ignore them. But you can't, you do it at your own risk, especially at universities. My research areas are these, at the moment, these 4 topics. The Ganzfeld, I'll describe it more clearly shortly. Dream states, especially lucid dreams, exceptional experiences amongst twins, and I will gladly leave the laboratory and investigate spontaneous cases. Like Richard Wiseman, I spent many of the night in haunted houses and haven't experienced anything, but I'm quite willing to experience things if they were there to experience. So, communication with critics. The critics are often say no evidence for the paranormal, but in fact the flagship of psychology, the Psychological Bulletin, recently published a meta-analysis of 3 response studies. Journal of Scientific Exploration also produced independently of this another meta-analysis of the Ganzfeld work. I'll be explaining Ganzfeld shortly. So there's this link with altered states of consciousness that's stood the test of time. It has ecological validity. People experience these things, these paranormal phenomena in altered states, and there are techniques to study this. And some of the techniques do seem to have reliability, but at what level? At the reliability of social psychology, you can say, but not at the reliability of biology. That's where you can guarantee to get results whenever you want. Anyway, I got involved in debates on this. If you want to read more, I published stuff in the Swedish Skeptic Society. In Swedish they're called Woofera. Vetenskap och folkbildning. Ganzfeld, what's that? What is that? It's basically a means of lifting into the laboratory what people experience. Generally, when people have psychic experiences, they are in an altered state of consciousness. Often a dream comes true. It can be very dramatic, or they can be half asleep and suddenly experience something, or take drugs and suddenly experience something that is very dramatic. Or hypnosis. There's a long tradition of association with the paranormal. I began, I think I mentioned, with an interest in hypnosis, but in order to fit into the laboratory and make it clean, I got interested in what's called the Ganzfeld technique, which has some similarities with hypnosis. It's a state of relaxation. It's the state that we all experience when we're falling asleep. I have a lot of so-called hypnagogic imagery. That's the sort of hallucinations that you have when you're just about to fall asleep. So we can actually produce such a state of mind in the laboratory by fitting people with earphones and sort of half of ping pong balls over their eyes, and so we produce a kind of homogeneous field of vision. So they see a warm red diffuse light. This was actually a technique developed in Berlin, in fact, in the 1920s, called Ganzfeld. That's what the name means, a sort of whole field of vision. But we do all the same thing with the ears. And what's the most pleasant source of stimulation for humans if you're going to try to make people relaxed? Do you know what it is? seashore noise, the sound of waves rhythmically on the beach. So we use that. Or you can use white noise, which some people like, but I don't think is a pleasant association. That combination makes people drift into sleep. And so here we have an altered state. We can put the receiver in an altered state of consciousness. And we have two rooms separated as far as we can, about 30 meters in the cellar of the psychology department. So we have a sender room, and there's the relaxation of Gansfeld. And the other room, we have to try to produce some sort of emotional experience. Ideally, we would like to, create a real emotional experience, but we have to do with trying to objectify everything. So we use film clips, of course, and try to make film clips interesting. You may, if you know any psychology, you will know that we have basically 4 emotions, and 3 of them are negative emotions. It has survival value. 3 negative emotions. So it's actually very hard to find positive films, but so it tends to be sort of films like, people being chased through the forest, or falling out of an aeroplane or something, something dramatic, or some kind of war scene. You can go through films and make up a kind of videotheque of various film clips, which we've done. We try to choose films that people don't know about, hard to find films. And we randomise them, or rather the computer randomise them. We put them into sets, and within the sets are randomised, and then the actual content of the sets are randomised. And so there's this blind matching technology, and the idea is that the person who's in this Gansfeld state has these dream experiences, documents them, because you can come back to reality now and again, speak into the microphone hanging there, and it can be fed into a sound card on the computer and digitalized, so you have a record of it, and you also have a digital record of the film, of course, but of control film. So you then place the sound of the dream, as it were, onto this, let's say 4 sets of films, which is what we generally use, and only one of them is a genuine film, the film that was shown in the room here at the same time as the person was in the dream state. And the goal of the whole thing is to see whether the person, on the basis of her or his own experiences, can recognize the film that was shown to the sender. So the sender has to try to influence the imagery of the receiver to correspond with what is seen. So if someone jumps out the aeroplane, the person says, I see something jumping out of an aeroplane, and it occurs, then that's really interesting. It's even more interesting if it occurs in real time. So our technique actually is an improvement over everything else that's been done previously. We have a means of checking out real-time correspondences. I can show you an example later if there's possibility. So this is a blind methodology technology, because the receiver doesn't know which film the computer has chosen, makes the choice and decides which one corresponds, and doesn't get to know until afterwards. And the experimenter doesn't know either, so there are no cues. And this basic technique has been used at many universities, you see here, throughout the world. To somewhere. So it's been. I was one of the people who first developed this technique, and since then it's was part of my doctoral thesis, and since then it's been applied to various universities throughout the world. And you get this sort of profile of results. Most of the studies have used a hit rate of 1 in 4, so chance should like 25% as a hit rate, and it doesn't clearly. There's a success here that's replicable, and most of the meta-analysis suggests it is replicable, that you are on the average somewhere around about 32 to 35% hit rate. That we have occasionally reached what I aim at, which is double the chance level, and then you don't need statistics, and you can't start arguing about statistics. It has happened in a few studies, and I think one on my own, I think we got about 44% hit rate. But resources are limited, and we run out of money for this, but we did get as far as making more sophisticated methods. Here we can look at real time and bookmark what the person said and see the correspondence. Here the person just said. In real time with the film, looks like something's been lifted, a tongue with an eye which holds something, and at that very moment the person says this, the sender is looking at this happening in the film. This is very selective. Just an example of what can be done. This is not proof of anything, just showing the methodology that can be developed. And here are the control, the films, the control film as well as the actual film. Okay, I'll leave Gansfeld now. We can discuss it a bit later. I have to say, I actually forgot to put a clip in here. If you want to read more, you can go to my website. You can look at some of these meta-analyses that are referred to. I'm not here today to prove whether ESP exists or not. That's not my aim. I'm even discuss whether it exists or not, really. I'm just trying to show that the whole thing is researchable and bring you up to date on current findings. And if you want to scrutinize it, you're welcome. I actually produced a compendium of evidence for psi, and that probably actually lost me the position in Lund because they don't really want to know about it. But anyway, the evidence is there, and I'm not saying it's proof. In experimental science, as you should know, we can't prove anything. It's all experimental evidence, and you should ideally then develop theories to go further. Another area that I got interested in is lucid dreams, and if you know nothing about this, you may have heard the film Inception. But what is a lucid dream? Well, it's being awakened while you're dreaming. So you're awake while you're dreaming. It may sound to be a contradiction if you haven't had it, but a lot of people have had these dreams, somewhere between 60 and 80%. So you have this insight that you're dreaming while you're dreaming. There are various types of lucid dreams. You can actually develop it further and steer your own dreams. You can meet dream people. You can decide over what you want to do and where you want to be. So it's quite fantastic. I've had it a few times. Unfortunately, there's a negative correlation between stress and lucid dreaming. And universities aren't the best places to have lucid dreams. I would go so far to say I'm at Stanford. I think it's one of the psychologists' very few discoveries. It's an actual discovery in psychology. A lot of psychology, I don't know if you agree, Jens, but a lot of psychology, as my supervisor used to say, is about clarifying and quantifying what everybody already knew. But this, they didn't know. And so it's a real discovery and what is interesting is that you can signal. If you're having a lucid dream, there's an apparatus that you can put over your eyes, with sensors that notice your eye movements. You have eye movements when you're dreaming, so they can, I'm not show this straight off and then you can see what I mean. There's this technique of a mask over your eyes. So you notice your eye movements, and then you can shine a bright light to increase your awareness. And the person fairly paralyzed during dreams can make small movements with a thumb or even a Morse code with the eye movements to let the experimenter know that you're dreaming. So it can signal to the experimenter. It may sound to be science fiction, but this is real science. There are two people who discovered it at the same time. Keith Hearn, actually, I think he was the first one who discovered this in '75, and then Stephen LaBerge. Stephen LaBerge I met about a year ago, very interesting person. He was doing his doctorate at Stanford, and you might expect now he'd be a well-respected researcher in psychology. No. He now runs dream groups on Hawaii. They didn't want him after doing this. It took many years for this finding to be accepted. It was only until late 1980s that it became accepted. So we can skip that. If you want to know more about lucid dreaming, it's a book by Robert Wagner. Our own research simply giving people questionnaires. 80% of students report lucid dreams, and I'm not a bit sceptical towards that. It might just be the in thing of the moment to report lucid dreams, the full inception. 24% report at least once a month, and of course the more from the head, the more developed, the richer the content. But there's a little group who I must get some time to do research with that say they experience it regularly and often. I've even met a couple of people who say they only experience lucid dreams, which is really fantastic. I've got doing research on that. And shared dreams is something, again, zero research on. Lots of internet groups where people share their experiences about shared dreams. That is, dreams where people dream of the same thing and experience the same dream reality. This, again, there's a skeptical side to myself. I wonder if this is true, but there's also an open side. I think this we should at least check out, but nobody's ever done it. Power naps are quite unusual by students, again, not really researched. Often short REM periods, so they often do actually contain dream imagery. And 21% of students use them regularly and plan to use it, so it's something one should do research on. Yeah, Richard Wiseman, who I mentioned, I saw a few moments ago, he's actually done something I think is quite commendable, but he has stolen it from somebody else, but he has come up with an app for the iPhone, and I wonder how many of you take your iPhone to bed with you. Well, to do this you have to do so, you have to put your iPhone in your bed, and after a while your iPhone senses, the app actually has a sensor in it to sense your body movements and produce a profile of your body movements. And since we are more paralyzed, the deeper we go into sleep and dreaming occurs at the deepest state, the brain wakes and the body sleeps, so to say, then theoretically you can sort of you can identify the REM periods, the dream periods. And then he has music suggestions, so hypnotic suggestions to the scene you're going to experience that is immediately played during these dream periods and should steer you into a dream reality. And he is interested in these clear dreams or lucid dreams. So I'm still a bit sceptical whether it'll work, but it's certainly worth trying, and he's managed to get a lot of publicity for it. So you could try it yourselves. You can actually try it without paying anything. So you can try one of his one of his sort of alternatives. The other alternative doesn't cost very much. Okay, we'll leave lucid dreams now, right? Third area of interest, exceptional experiences. I got interested in twins simply because there are so many anecdotal reports of twins experiencing totally unexpected things in different parts of the world, or these not just telepathy, but even odd synchronicities. They've been separated from birth, and they will turn up and have the same lifestyle, the same job, married someone with the same name, and so on and so on and so on. Even use the same toothpaste. And some of these are quite remarkable, and there's even an anecdotal case of twins separated and were dying at exactly the same time. If you go to orthodox twin research, it says it's all genetics, all genetics. If it was all genetics, it would mean that more or less that people think of the same thing at the same time because of genetics. I mean that psychology, forget it. There's no cognitive psychology. It's just a waste of time. It should be all cognitive genetics. Here's an example of this. A woman who said she was skeptical wrote to me that she had actually taken photos of what had happened because it was so startling for her. And one of her twins came home with a black eye. Somebody kicked her in the face in the playground. The other twin, who was somewhere else, also came home without knowing she also had a black eye. Coincidence or some form of synchronicity? Well, we can actually do research on it. And again, we use a blind methodology. One twin is the receiver, so we wire her up up or him up to sensors. It's like a lie detector. We can record breathing and blood pulses, blood pressure, and the most important thing is skin resistance. Skin resistance reflects the degree of anxiety you have. So if you give him a shock, he will begin to sweat quite simply, and you can notice it through the recording. Electrodermal response, as it's called. And the other twin will be exposed to some kind of shock stimulus. The easiest thing to do is put the arm in a bucket of ice, unexpectedly. It has to be, again, randomized. Everything must be blind. The experimenter doesn't know who's recording this, when this happens, and randomized. So it occurs at a random point in time that a random number program decides. And then you can look afterwards and see what happens if there's a deviation in the curve at the very point in time the arm of the other twin goes into the bucket of ice. It's a fairly simple methodology. But we've done this on a couple of occasions, and we did it in Copenhagen first, and with the support, in both occasions we had the support of TV companies. We could never get research money from the normal sources, from science councils for this, but there was quite a lot of money, and we got through ABC to do it, American Broadcasting Corporation, and from Danish TV. So we did one study in Copenhagen, one study in London. Again, it had to be a very small sort of pilot study. We're not aiming at proving anything except to develop a methodology that would work, the methodology just described. In Copenhagen, one twin did seem to have some sort of ability. It's impossible to say from such a few trials, but if you looked at her results, they were significant, but you put the girl with the other twins, they weren't. We had the same was true of the London study. We found two twins, twin pair here. We test them independently, swap roles, I should explain that. One twin takes an sender, the other receiver, and then they swap around. In London study, it was the pair of twins, who both, when they swapped around, seemed to be responsible for all the hits. The thing was, which shows the uniqueness and the difficulty of doing research in this area, this particular twin pair in London, one of them was pregnant, and neither of them believed in telepathy or extrasensory perception, or whatever you would call it, until she became pregnant, and then they developed such a closeness that they felt that they were reading each other's minds. And it worked. Well, it worked in the sense that they got the electrodermal response showed deviations at the right time. But try to replicate that. We can't really replicate a pregnancy. So it just shows the difficulties that sometimes occur. It's all very easy for critics to say, I want to experiment and replicate every day in any place in the world or something. But human experience is so difficult, it's always unique. So we do the best we can here. And I should note that in passing that there are several different types of identical twins. And perhaps the most promising from a theoretical point of view are twins that are late separators. They're called mo-mo, so monochronic and monoamnionic, I think is the English word. That is, they share the same placenta and the same mother cell. It's rare, but there's a theoretical reason why they might be interesting to study. So, what do we know about the paranormal? Well, it seems very dependent on the researcher, the experimenter, the atmosphere, the expectancies. There's a so-called sheep-goat effect, which is well established, does seem to be replicable on the whole. Believers score positively, non-believers tend to score at chance, or even sometimes below chance, significantly below chance, so they choose the wrong response at a level that they So people always come when the party finishes, sort of thing. But what is perhaps most controversial, perhaps the experimenter's own psychic ability may influence results. So I'll return to that a little later. There are also a few studies that of well-controlled studies of mediums, spiritualistic mediums. I know 3 that have been really studied to the extent that they've used private detectives to check out whether they could be getting information by cheating. So some well-controlled studies. And of course, like everything, you can always find rather contrived explanations for the successes. Same is true of the experimental evidence for ESP, I want to call it telepathy or whatever. There's no absolute compelling evidence in the sense that you must absolutely believe in it. You can always find contrived explanations for all of
Can
this.
I ask you about one medial person, Edward Case?
Edward Case, he wouldn't occur in one of my 3 mediums.
Was he
healing.
Was he scrutinized?
No.
Never.
I'm sure he was, depends on the level of scrutiny. He wasn't scrutinized to the extent that I know of any peer-reviewed publications on him.
But he was active in the 1930s?
Yes.
And he used to find lost keys and things like that for people?
I know more in the area of healing. I know there are worlds of those claims. But to be honest, I haven't looked closely at them. In the whole area of mediumship, there are lots and lots of claims, anecdotal reports, people swearing blind that the medium did that. But what I'm more interested in where they have actually used methodologies like blind assessments, control groups, and so on. And Edward Case, I don't think that was used. But for other mediums it has been. So, I mustn't forget, paranormal phenomena not dangerous, so poltergeist phenomena, apparitions and so on. The interesting thing is if you look at the serious studies of these things, nobody has ever been hurt by these phenomena. So the mass media image of this is totally wrong. The sort of what do you call it? Skräck film. The horror film image is absolutely a distortion. What do we know about consciousness? Well, we know that it occurs in different forms and different degrees of intensity throughout the animal kingdom. It's not so long ago that people used to say that we are unique because we have this, that, and the other abilities amongst animals, and consciousness is one of them, and we're the only animal that is really conscious. But that has totally been rejected now. There's evidence for cognitive abilities. Even in birds, there is evidence that they can. I'm not convinced by it, but there is evidence that they have concept formation. And recognition of the self in front of the easiest way to do is show a mirror to a young child, and you put a cross on the head, and about a year and a half they react to the cross being on the forehead. And you can do similar experiments with apes and animals, and it used to be thought it was only a certain type of monkey that showed this, but now it's been found almost a wide range of different animals. So consciousness occurs throughout the animal kingdom. We have also, as I mentioned earlier, enormous capacity to dramatize and create realities. So there's some truth in the fact one should be skeptical to these anecdotal reports, but I think there's no evidence one should dismiss it. Actually, if you look at some of the anecdotal reports, the opposite to what critics claim happens, namely, rather than becoming more dramatic, they could become more normalized. So if somebody documents something like, say, poltergeist phenomena, and you interview them, document them, and tape and so on, and then go back 10 years later, they tend to dismiss it and try to find normal explanations for it, whereas at the time they were totally flabbergasted. The unconsciousness, the altered states of consciousness can be seen as a way of expressing the unconscious, Freud's unconscious. Frederick de Myers, a contemporary of Freud, and in many ways a predecessor of Freud, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psycho-Research, said the unconscious is a gold mine as well as a scrap heap. And I think that's a good way of summarizing the positive aspects to altered states of consciousness. They're a great source of creativity. It's hard to find creative discoveries in science or arts that don't have the actual creative process occurring during an altered state of consciousness. And then, perhaps the most controversial area concerns these quantum effects, these non-local effects. They seem now to have been found in the brain. How many understand what non-local effects are? Okay, not so many. Well, simplest thing is take these positrons that earlier were paired, particle of the atom or the nucleus of the atom, and you can dislodge them, make them go in different directions. And previously it was only a few millimeters apart you could do this experiment. Now it's being done in Geneva over several miles. So you take one particle, alter its spin, and its pair, the other one, alters its spin as well. Now, it's wrong to say there's any communication between the two. That's New Age would talk about particle telepathy, but it's not that. It seems to be a kind of inbuilt synchronicity in nature, these non-local effects. And
this is not. Is it? I was one physicist doing this, and he said it's not very clear that these effects happen. It's just been like very few studies. It was very uncertain.
I'd be surprised if that's true. It's reached many of the major journals. Are you talking about the brain, or are you talking about non-local effects in general?
In the entanglements.
In the entanglement.
The exact thing that you were speaking about, the spin.
Yeah, I think I've heard physicists say this has been well established for many years.
This was 2 years ago.
No, outside the brain it's fairly well established.
I think so. It's in
this
the brain.
This is the Alain aspect experiments. You know, it's even called the twin photon.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But inside the brain, I mean, then it's more speculative.
Yeah. That's right, and you can look at, if you want to look further, check out Scientific American, Living in a Quantum World, Small-Scale Physics as a spooky power of the laughable world at large. It's just a really interesting area, and it produces a lot of, sometimes a bit of defensiveness amongst physicists, because the whole world, physics world now, is in a state of array, in a state of chaos, if it were. The interesting area is how you go from these quantum levels to macro levels, to the kind of events that we observe, to these events that you study in psychology. There is even a publication in New Scientist that suggested that memory might work through non-local effects. I don't think as yet there's any evidence for it, but I was quite surprised I got into a journal like New Scientist. There is evidence, as I said, that some of these effects occur in the brain now. Previously it was thought to be highly unlikely because the brain was too cold, too warm rather, and too wet, but now they have been found. Certainly during a very, very short period, a fraction of a second, but who knows what might happen. And if they found in different areas, well, not be found, and if they are found in different areas of the brain, this, as speculated with memory, may explain some of the normal psychological processes in the brain. And let's speculate a little there. If these normal psychological processes within the brain use quantum effects, and I am speculating, then it's not a big leap to imagine that this could also occur between two brains. And so the same principle could be applied to extrasensory perception, that is, extrasensory perception, non-local effects, maybe just the way nature works, a kind of inbuilt synchronicity. So, let's see what time is here. Formulate suggestions how we can go further. Well, we can wait with this. We can develop it further. There is, in fact, an area has been called quantum biology. There is a well-known immunologist called Robert Lanzo, who thinks that this hierarchical model of putting physics as the top science to emulate is all wrong. In fact, consciousness is part of nature and is part of physics. All our laws, all these constancies that we talked about, like Planck's constants, are an idea that consciousness has come with to explain its own existence. And consciousness is really part of the whole picture, and it's crazy to try to eliminate it from it. We should rather put consciousness studies at the top of the hierarchy, or rather biology at least should be the top science, not physics. So, but we can mediate all that kind of crystallizing out and becoming an accepted viewpoint, and then we might be able to do more productive research in this area. One of my colleagues, Ed May, says now science isn't ready for this. Well, we can try and find a strong science source, and that's why I'm interested in Gansfeld, or was when I had money for it, and twins. And it's only when you really have a high source of the phenomenon that you know it's not due to any kind of experimental error or due to cheating or whatever. But the most difficult area, which left to last, I think, is that of the experimental effect. This is one of the founders, perhaps the founder of experimental parapsychology, J.B. Ryan, and you can immediately see how charismatic he was. And he got, in the beginning, very successful results. Some under fairly well-controlled conditions. And the question is, this charisma can be both a blessing and a handicap. In that charisma isn't something one can quantify in a test tube very easily, and data give it out to different researchers. This quotation is just worth repeating. Ryan gave parapsychology everything it needed to become a respected science, except one important thing: that know how not to produce positive results when they need to be demonstrated. And that, I think, is still true to a large extent. And the question is the experimental effect just due to personal charm, enthusiasm, participants creating positive expectancies, or is there something more to it? It's the issue of the experiment aside, this is what it might be more, it might be the experiment's own psychic ability which might influence the results. This, I think, is crucial to the current psi wars. Ray Hyman, who I mentioned earlier, he's the grand old man of skepticism in this area. He announced in The Skeptic the demise of parapsychology. And he was supported by Richard, of course. He actually wrote, "Put up or shut up" challenge to parapsychologists. And he quoted one of Ryan's colleagues who wrote this, that at any particular date, since 1882, when interest began in this area, you could find promising results, but these results were often very difficult to replicate or failed recently. So the replication is a great problem in the area. Recently I wrote, very recently, about parapsychology is best kept secret. I wasn't sure this secret should be kept still secret. But I got perhaps inspired a bit by Assange and Snowden that secrets should come out. So I published a paper on this about documenting all the successful experimenters. People like Martin Johnson, for instance, a Swedish experimenter, very successful. But he had his own psychic experiences. To even Ryan, when he was tested as a subject, scored significantly high on so-called PK tests, psychokinesis, influencing dice with an experiment, on 2 occasions. And there are many examples of this. There's another Swedish experimenter, Håkan Forwald, who got many of the positive results. he experimented on himself, and then he went to Ryan's laboratory, was tested under controlled conditions there, and got positive results. There are so many examples of this, and I think it's rather hard to find the opposite. One should look for contradictory evidence. There's little contradictory evidence to show that successful experimenters don't have their own ability. And some of my own results, if I'm upfront about it, I've gone in as a subject myself in experiments and scored rather successfully, well, not rather, very successfully. So that is both a kind of blessing and a severe problem in science, as science is supposed to be objective. But I think we need to study that, we need to face it. I haven't, so the thing is, quotation from Ryan here. This was when I was a teenager. It takes me back many years when I wrote to Ryan and first got interested in this field. And even then I got interested in the experimental effect. And Ryan himself admitted that this might be a problem, or might be a rather necessary condition that the experimenter had to have his own abilities in order to induce such a subject. So this is a private letter that I've now taken out and circulated. I kept quiet about this simply because I don't know what skeptics would just laugh and make fun of it, I'm afraid. But well, one has to take risks, one has to reveal secrets, I think. So that's where I'm at the moment. I want to just finish with a couple of quotations. One from Planck, I mentioned earlier, in the context of Rupert Sheldrake's talk about these constancies. He regards consciousness as the basis to the universe, that materia is, I have to put this back into English now, is a product of the activity of consciousness. And we can't get away from consciousness, the important role of consciousness. That everything we discuss, everything we believe exists, requires consciousness. And a quotation from, well, Planck was one of the most famous physicists, a quotation from what is, I think, now regarded as the founder of psychology. He used to be considered Wundt, Wilhelm Wundt. But now William James seems to be generally accepted the founder of psychology as it is today. William James was fascinated by psychical research, by mediums, but the biographies of him tend to put that down. Anyway, he wrote this famous statement that a normal state of consciousness is only one of many states of consciousness, many special states, and no explanation of the universe, which leaves this no explanation of the universe can be found which leaves these different states of consciousness aside. I can't put it back into English now. Which doesn't take into account these altered states of consciousness. No account of the universe can be found which doesn't focus on these states. Okay, what's ESP? Just to finish off, well, I'll leave it to you now. We've got three alternatives to choose from. It could be extrasensory perception, that is a sixth sense, as Ryan thought it was originally. It could be error someplace, or it could be some sort of exceptional synchronous perception. So, that's it, and now I'm curious to know what you think. Time. I don't actually have a watch.
No, we are sort of almost at the finished time, but I think I will have time for some questions. Sure. Yeah.
I was thinking way back when you talked about these near-death experiences and these random numbers or random pictures or something. And you said there were about 60 cases or something like that. How many negative would you need to sort of say that, well, okay, we try our best? This
Well,
might
yeah,
not be
good
the case.
question, but let me clarify. these 60 cases of people returning. I haven't, unfortunately, in my memory, how many people had experiences. I think very few because of the medication.
Sure.
So
but the question
what I
remains,
would really like to answer your question would be cases of people claiming they had seen the computer randomized image and getting it wrong. I don't think there was one case of that, but if you've got, I don't know, it's up to one's own personal judgment here. Certainly if you're getting, say, 20 such cases where they're getting it wrong, then I think you turn it around and say that the generating false images and false security and so on. It would be also interesting to know how certain they're getting. So, but I think I would throw the question back at you. How many spontaneous cases of these, because there's plenty in the literature, would convince you that it was worth doing more research on it?
Well, spontaneous in the
sense of people reporting things that in another room in the hospital that was going on that they shouldn't know about, and then the doctors have kind of documented this.
I don't know that, but I mean there is research
how many
on it, so I mean that there is a need to do research on it. I mean there is research on it.
Okay, so you're already convinced there's need to do research.
Well, I'm not against doing research on it.
Right, good. Yeah.
That's all I just, I don't really, I just want to know.
No, I'm perhaps too used to dealing with fanatical so-called wannabe skeptics who, to every price, don't even want to do research on it.
I would say that a true skeptic would be the skeptic that is skeptic of the skeptics. So
that's right, I agree. A true skeptic actually should check out his own skeptical explanations. Yeah, that's good. Then I'm great, I've achieved something in this talk. Yeah, that's actually one of my goals when I'm teaching, is to create true skepticism.
Can I just ask about this same kind of near-death experience? I think I read somewhere that there actually was some positive evidence that they had. This was the kind of experience where you're leaving your sick bed and you're sort of hovering above it and you're seeing the doctors going into you. And then they had chalked a number somewhere above the head of this person, which was impossible to see unless you were seeing it from outside.
You're actually, this again is the creative ability of memory, putting things together. I think you're putting together two things here. There are lots of these anecdotal reports of patients reporting what's happened in the hospital and so on during near-death experience. There are a couple of studies, one in particular, of out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. Not near-death, but out-of-body experiences. But there
You've got the original memory back now.
Right, but there seems to have been some positive reports.
Yeah, he got some, he had somebody who often had out-of-body experience, sleep in the laboratory, wider up and to EEG and so on, and put a random number on top of a cupboard out of sight. And she got the number correct during her out-of-body experience. The problem was, there was unfortunate weakness. There was a clock in the room, and it might have been just possible for her, if she had a flashlight or something, to get a reflected image of the number. But it sounded pretty well contrived. Again, things can never be proof of anything, but they should encourage more research. When Tart reported this, he thought it would. And so he wasn't particularly concerned about following this up. But nobody in the science community really followed it up.
But in this case, for instance, I'm just to ask, was this person asked about this number, or did she spontaneously report? I saw a number.
No. She knew it was an experiment. That was the point.
So that's.
It's also possible that Tata shows me it wouldn't work. I tried a skeptical explanation. Could she have taken off the electrodes and gotten up and looked at them? He said the ink would have spewed all over the place. That was true.
How big was the number?
I think it was at least a 5-digit number.
Okay, so that's statistically.
The chances of guessing the number.
Yeah, that's one of the other things. You have to know some things about the statistics of these things and the probabilities of
I can't recall the exact probability, but it was outside the normal range, so it's not what we consider to be coincidence.
I have a clarifying question.
Yeah, sure.
The lucid dreaming, in what way is it considered paranormal? Isn't it?
No, it's not paranormal. No, but people often report paranormal experiences during lucid dreams, especially in context of what has not been researched either, namely shared dreams. People can, if you go to the internet and put in a search word shared dreams, you'll find almost another reality. People reporting that they meet in some kind of, what can you call it, interpersonal space during dream states. And as they say, I remember reading all of these sites, science can't cope with this, so we must experiment ourselves. Yeah. I think science should at least look at it. I mean, it may sound a bit far out, but challenge, yeah. Yeah, any other questions?
I've heard about another phenomenon in dreaming is the continuous dreams or dreams in episodes. That two dreams are connected the story with a wakeful state in between. Is that accepted in the
Connect
community?
the story with a wakeful state. You mean, are our wakeful experiences related to dreams?
No, somebody's dreaming and he wakes up, does something and again goes to sleep and the dream starts from where it stopped. The story stops.
Yeah, sure. That happens quite often. Yeah, sure. That the dream has a dream sequence. If you record dreams over the week, and then you mix them all up in random order, give them to a judge to do this sort of blind matching, he or she can put them in the right order, more than chance anyway. So yeah, dreams often seem to be working at some level for some people, working through a problem.
I want to bring up the question of individual variation.
Yeah.
So, when it comes to being an artist, we accept that some people are much better than others. When it comes to anything, mostly we have great individual variation. So, why shouldn't we maybe tolerate that here? Is it supposed to be so basic that all human beings should have this, or is it possible that some people are just much more attuned to this sort of stuff than others?
The evidence isn't in yet, because basically there are so few people doing research in this area, and most of the research has been orientated towards trying to find a technique that works or prove it or something. But there is some research on linking these abilities to artistic ability, especially musical ability. There was one of the most successful studies with Gansfeld was done on musicians. But I think your general question is there individual variation? Yes, it does seem to be, absolutely. It may be like other abilities that some people have it more than others. But it's not like other abilities in the sense that the conditions are so independent. That the ability is so independent of conditions. I mean, if you're intelligent, you can usually perform fairly well on intelligence tests, no matter whether there's noise around or stress around. But if you're a musician, it's going to be influenced a bit by the environment you're in, and it seems to be even more so a psychic ability. So it's influenced by the experiment and by the expectancies, which might explain why people like Richard Wiseman have a life experience of not getting positive results. Yeah.
Can I ask? Why do you think these, I mean, you believe in that these things are?
It's interesting you should say that. It depends which me you're speaking to.
Okay, never mind.
No, I have to answer that. As part of me that is skeptical still.
Well, that's good. But why do you think that these phenomena are so rare? I mean, if they exist, why are they so rare? And why do you do these Gansfeld tests? Okay, so you get a significant, but it's still very low. Why does it work but works so badly?
That's again a good question. Why don't you get 100% rates? And it's certainly my objective in doing research is not to get small deviations from chance, but to get really successful results. I'm not convinced what you say about your claim here that these phenomena are so rare.
I've never
If you go amongst the
experienced
population
myself, but
okay.
so that's, to
but
me
if you do
that's rare.
surveys, they're not rare. About 50% of the population in various countries, from European countries and North America, report having these experiences. The most common one is telepathy, and the most common basis for it is not having, the most common basis for believing in them is not the literature or anything; it's their own experiences.
Okay, but say like, I mean,
about half the population experiences, but nobody at university is doing research.
Okay, but rare in the sense that every day I get input through my other senses.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
This happens. That in that sense, it's rare.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, but like Jens was saying, it probably depends a lot on personality. When we did our studies, for instance, Gansfeld studies, I purposely avoided. I think the first study I didn't avoid psychology students, but they scored extraordinarily badly. So I then advertised for New Age people, people had their own experiences, and it was with them we got our positive results. Yeah. So I think if you're doing research and say avoid psychology students, so because we're very intellectual, we're not meditating every day. We're not so focused on any experiences. I think you have to go back to what Jens was saying. There's going to be enormous individual variation. But certainly it's true amongst the population as a whole. It's claimed to be common. But the skeptic in me would say that there are many normal explanations to all the things that the population as a whole come with. And perhaps the open-minded part of me would say at most 10% are probably have something demanding a paranormal explanation, perhaps. So there's some truth in what you say, but yeah, I don't know the real answer behind that, why it's not quite every day. It would probably disturb our world far too much. It's probably not an evolutionary advantage to have it too much. There's a film called, what's it called? The Hereafter? Is it called that? Annie Katrine, what's it called?
Yes,
this film, The Hereafter?
Is
That right? Yes. It's about this. I don't know if you've seen it. It's one of Clint Eastwood's films, sensitive films, about how it can be a real handicap to have this ability.
Yeah. So now we're all convinced that this is an interesting area to do some research in.
That's a fantastic goal if I achieve that. That would be superb.
Some of us, individual variation, are more convinced than others. Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay.